to the third night of the Bishop Hill Virtual Chautauqua. We are so glad you are here. For those who were here for the past two nights, you've heard some of this, but it bears repeating. The word Chautauqua, I love the word. I wish it were in common usage. Most people have no clue how to say it when they see it or what it means. And without going way back in history, it is actually an Algonquin language word that means fish kill. Because in the Finger Lake region of New York, when the fish came up the river in the spring to spawn, they would harvest the fish, smoke, and dry them. But it was in Chautauqua, New York, that the first Chautauqua was held. And they still have one every summer. You should go. Or better yet, come to Bishop Hill. Our face-to-face Chautauqua this summer will be August 27th and 28th. We're still working on some of the details about our guest speakers, but I'm pretty sure that Buffalo Bill, Mark Twain, Herbert Hoover, and Jane Addams are going to be there, and I'm working on two more. I want to add a few musicians to the mix. History in Person is one of the sponsors of this evening, so please hit that little red subscribe button on YouTube, and if you subscribe tonight, you'll get access to all 6 performances, including any night that you missed. And those will be posted for just 1 week for the public. So watch them sometime in the next few days. And part of the beauty of doing it on YouTube is you can watch it on your large screen TV and not just on a little laptop or phone or something. And I should also take a moment and thank our sponsors. We really couldn't do this without the Bishop Hill Heritage Association. Todd DeDecker in particular has been wonderful to work with. We are partners in this. History in Person and the Bishop Hill Heritage Association are producing this evening's virtual Chautauqua as well as the summer Chautauqua. The Bishop Hill Heritage Association manages at least 9 buildings in town, and there's rumor there might be more. They sponsor lots of great events throughout the summer. Go to their YouTube channel, Bishop Hill Heritage Association. BHHA is their website, and check out what they're doing. They did a great lecture series last year for the 175th anniversary, and most of those lectures, including the role of women in the colony, the material culture by an anthropologist friend of mine. It's really a great lecture series. We're also sponsored by the American Scandinavian Foundation. As a matter of fact, this first performance of Peter Christian Asbjornsen was put together in part due to a grant. Thank you, American Scandinavian Foundation. Barbara Osher Pro Suiza Foundation has been a big supporter of Bishop Hill in general, but especially this Chautauqua series, and we are grateful. The Illinois Arts Council, a state agency, funds a variety of programs, including the Chautauqua. Bill and Susan Sherrard Foundation has been a consistent sponsor, SWIA Chicago, and the Twin Flower Inn Bed and Breakfast. Maybe I should warn you, if you want to come to the face-to-face Chautauqua, you should make reservations soon. I booked 2 rooms today, and we are usually full that weekend. So we hope to see you August 27th and 28th. But let's get to the show. Let me get out of the way here and tell you about our first speaker. Peter Christian Asbjornsen was an oceanographer who discovered this 9-legged sea star from the depths of the fjords. He was a technology inventor that invented a machine that would go down to the depths of the fjords and harvest the creatures so they could study them for the first time ever. Hence Freya's star, that 9-legged creature that he found and named after Freya, Norse goddess, because he also collected folklore. He was Norway's first sod scientist and timber management. So he did bisects of Scandinavia. And while he was studying the forest, responsible for sustainable harvesting of those forests, which are still some of the healthiest in the world, he was collecting folk tales. At first a fan of William Grimm, and then he went to Germany to study their forestry practices and became a friend of Wilhelm Grimm. But you'll hear a lot of that in the show. Scandinavian folklore as collected by Peter Christian Asbjornsen.
I must say I am pleased that so many of you would come to hear me, though you don't really know my name. Why are you here? Maybe you would like to hear about the deep sea creatures that I discovered when I was still at the university. I developed a mechanism. I could drop deep into the fjords off the coast of Norway. And with this shovel with a lid, I could pull one rope, the lid would close, and I could scrape creatures off the depths of the ocean. I discovered several new species, including a giant starfish that was 9 feet across with 9 arms. I named it for Freya's jewelry, the great star that she wore upon her chest. For it was Freya's star. And even as a young man, I was fascinated with the folklore and the stories of the Norse gods and goddesses. Maybe it is not deep sea creatures you want to hear about. Maybe you would like to hear about forestry management. I was Norway's first forestry management director. I had the great good fortune to go to Germany and study Germany's history of forest management, and I learned much about what not to do. For Germany clear-cut their ancient forest, and the forest became like deserts. The soil was washed away. And so I look for the old growth, and I make sure that at least a few of the ancient trees, they survive. And we do selective cutting. It is also important to understand the forest of the lowlands along the coast have a different speciation than the forest of the midlands and the steep slopes, which have different forest than the crowns of the mountains. And the forest that encircles the crown before you reach the high altitude where the wind-blown trees are the only ones that will survive. And so if you plant the right species of tree at the right altitude, paying attention to rainfall and soil, then your forest will be more healthy. But as I did transects of the forest of Scandinavia, I camped with the woodcutters, with the peasants and farmers, and every evening, sitting around the fire, I collected stories. It is not forest management you want to hear about? Maybe you'd like to hear about turf management. Do we have any farmers here? Are you grazing cattle or sheep? You grow different grasses to feed them. And by managing the turf, again, I had the great good fortune to go to Germany and study European turf management at the university there, and I learned what not to do. If you rotate the kinds of crops you grow with your turf and the kinds of animals, I understand there's a farmer just north. He thinks he's doing something new, and it is very good. Have you been to Grateful Graze? By doing integrated turf management, by herding cattle and sheep and chickens, and having different animals, then each deposit a different kind of fertilizer. And each take advantage of a different kind of product. And you get more production from that acreage, and the soil is healthier. So the grass is healthier. Again, as I was studying the turf of Norway and throughout Scandinavia, I would camp with the peasant farmers. They warmly welcomed me into their home, and I collected stories. You do not want to hear about turf management. I know why you came. It was for the stories. My hero, when I was a small boy, was Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm. You know the Grimm brothers. They began to collect the fairy tales of Europe before I was even born. As a child, those stories were read the world over and translated into many languages. And so, while in the university, I set out to collect all the Scandinavian folklore that I could. I had a good friend, Jørgen Moe. Christensen and Moe. Look for our books. I'm sure they're in your library. Jørgen was a very different kind of character, but a good partner. He was born to a wealthy family. His father or grandfather was a minister, and he followed in the parents' footsteps, and he studied for the ministry. He earned a degree in theology. I obviously trained as a scientist. But by putting our thoughts together, we're able to read more into the stories, below the stories, to understand the depth and the origin. It was about this time when we began to publish that Henry wrote Schoolcraft, a name you may not know. Do you know Schoolcraft? Schoolcraft was the first geologist to find the headwaters of the Mississippi. He married an Anishinaabe or Chippewa woman, and he was the first to collect the indigenous stories of America as a scholar, to deeply appreciate how the culture is influenced by the science, the landscape, how the trees, the prairies, the rivers provide the context for the stories. Can you say cultural biogeography? Think about it. How does your culture reflect the geology, the biology? The best way to see this is through the stories. You see the culture's relationship to their environment, and you see how they honor and live within as a part of the environment. It was about the same time that a man who eventually became my friend, Prince Maximilian. Prince Maximilian was a German prince. He was the 8th son of the king. He knew he would never be king. And so in 1819, he went to the rainforest of South America, and he lived among the Borocudo Indians. And as he was there collecting their stories, he asked a very simple question. Are the Indians of North America like the Indians of South America? Are they a different race of people? Or is it simply because they live in a different environment with different resources that is reflected in their stories? Consider this. Are you Christian? Does Jesus not talk about separating the wheat from the chaff? The sheep from the goats? Clearly, the Christian stories come from an agricultural society that grew wheat and tended sheep. And so the metaphors used by the storytellers reflect the habitat, the environment. How is your culture influenced by the place where you choose to live? Do you put on more clothing when it gets cold? Do you wish you could peel off more layers today? The fruits that we harvest in the summer. Have you had a good peach lately? Or watermelon for breakfast? Yes. How these become the elements of the stories you tell. When I was in Germany, I blush at the thought of it. Jakob Grimm had already left this world, but his younger brother Wilhelm was teaching at the University of Berlin, and I got to meet Wilhelm Grimm, my hero. Who would like to meet your heroes? Who are they? If you could dine with them, what questions might you ask? Not only did I get to meet Wilhelm Grimm, but I was starstruck that he had read the books that Mo and I had published. And he sang our praises. He said that I was his hero. He said that Scandinavian folklore has much to contribute to the world of folklore. For in the Grimm's brothers' stories, it is often some knight in shining armor who is rescuing some damsel in distress. But in Scandinavian folklore, it's often that damsel who is doing the rescuing. Not only of herself, but of that fool who got himself into trouble in the first place. The women laugh at this point, yes? Did you rescue that fool you're sitting beside? Do you even know my name? I've not said it yet. Well, I did mention. Peter Christian Asbjornsen. You know my stories. The Three Billy Goats Gruff is probably the most famous story that we collected because I was doing turf management. And we all know that on the other side of the fence, the grass is greener, is it not? Once upon a time, where all good stories begin, there were 3 billy goats, and yes, they were gruff. There was a big billy goat, there was a medium-sized billy goat, and there was a wee little billy goat. And because across the stream, over the bridge, on the hillside, and it is true, in the summer, spring moves north. And so the freshest grass you'll find at a higher elevation. These goats, they know where they live. But as the first little goat went across the bridge, clippity-clop, clippity-clop, underneath the bridge there lived... who is that crisscrossing my bridge? It is I, the little billy goat. I am going to gobble you up. No, please do not eat me, the little billy goat said. Wait, in just a few minutes, my bigger brother, the medium billy goat Gruff, he will come. I am barely a morsel. He will fill your belly. And the troll let him cross, clippity-clop, clippity-clop. And just a few moments later, as he promised, the medium-sized billy goat, clippity-clop, clippity. Who is that crossing my bridge? It is I, the medium-sized goat. I am going to gobble you up. No, do not eat me, for in just a moment, my big brother, he will be a feast. Let me cross, and you can surprise him. And the troll let him cross, clippity-clop, clippity-clop. And just as he promised, a few moments later, the big billy goat Gruff, clippity-clop, clippity-clop, he came crossing. Who is that crossing my bridge? It is I, the big billy goat Gruff. I am now going to gobble you up. And the troll swung from underneath the bridge, and he blocked the path. But at this point, the large billy goat had already lowered his horns. He scratched at the bridge. He raced, and kaboom! He hit that troll, and he was knocked clear to next Sunday. And the 3 billy goats Gruff, they grazed that grass on the mountainside until their bellies were full. And I think they might still be there until this day. We all love trolls, do we not? I'm sure you've met a few. There are trolls about, and we must keep our wits about us. High in the mountains, there was a family, a meager family. They struggled to make ends meet. And because the father of the family had fallen into debt, he decided that maybe it was time to cut some trees. If he cleared a portion of the land that he had inherited from his great-grandfather, that maybe they could sell the timber and they could pay off the debt. And so the father said to his oldest son, it is time for you to go and cut some trees. And the oldest son took half a loaf of bread and a lump of cheese and an axe upon his shoulder, and he marched across the far meadow to the very edge of the ancient forest. No sooner had he stepped into the cool shade and felt the breeze, he raised the axe over his head and thwack, thwack, thwack. And just as he began to chop this ancient tree, out came a troll. Who are you cutting my trees? I shall gobble you up. And off ran the oldest boy. What is it about these trolls always wanting to gobble you up? Well, when the oldest son returned without the axe and said, there's a terrible troll. I cannot cut the trees. He claims the trees are his. The next day, the second son was sent with a half a loaf of bread and a lump of hard cheese and the father's other older axe over his shoulder. He marched across the far meadow And when he arrived in the forest, amongst the ancient trees, the cacophony of insects singing, the cool breeze, he raised the axe over his head and thwack, thwack, out came the troll. I'm going to gobble you up if you cut another of my trees. The boy ran off, and when he returned home without the axe, they both chided the youngest brother, whose name, by the way, was Ashlad. Have you heard of Ashlad? And maybe I'll tell you more about him later. But Ashlad, they said, you cannot go. You are not brave enough. That troll, he will gobble you up. But Ashlad said, it is my turn. I'll go. Now, some thought that Ashlad was a bit of a fool. But he did keep what little wits he had about him. And when his mother said, I have no more bread, I have no more cheese, he said, I think I saw some spoiled milk. I'll pour it in some cheesecloth and I'll make curd. And that will be enough. And his father said, but what about an axe? I have no more. He said, I think my brothers left the axes where I need them, and I will find them. And he crossed the far meadow. When he arrived in the ancient grove, yes, there were both axes. He set one aside. He picked up the sharpest, newer one, and thwack, out came the troll. No, you shall not gobble me up, said Ashlad. If you try, I will squeeze your heart like this stone. And he pulled out the curd. I will squeeze your heart until blood drips from it like blood dripping from this white stone. You must know, trolls are quite simple and easy to fool. And when the troll saw the white blood coming from the white stone, he said, do not squeeze my heart. Do not harm me. Maybe you can help me, said Ashlad. I have 2 axes. And the troll said, maybe we can have a contest. We can see who can chop down the most trees. And so Ashlad picked up his axe. The troll picked up the other. Thwack, 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 thwack. As fast as the troll went, Ashlad kept pace. But Ashlad made sure that he timed his thwack, so he always got in the last thwack. Timber! So it appeared that every tree they felled was felled by Ashlad. And before the afternoon had passed, they had cleared just enough timber. The boy estimated the board feet, that if they lopped off the branches and they stacked the logs, he could more than pay for his father's debt, and the rest of the forest would still stand. The troll said, it's getting late. Too late for you to find your way home. It'll be dark soon. Why don't you spend the night in my lair? You can rest there, and we can cut more trees tomorrow. Ashlad saw the wisdom in such a decision. It was getting dark, and so he followed the troll up into the crevasse of the mountain where 2 steep peaks came together. There was a deep cave. The troll, he picked up 2 huge iron kettles. He handed them to Ashlad. He said, take them to the spring down the hill and fill them both. We shall eat porridge for supper. But Ashlad took one look at those iron kettles. He could not lift one, let alone carry 2, especially if they were filled with water. And so thinking quickly, he said, that's too much work for me. It would be much easier for me to move the spring. I'll just turn the spring so it runs uphill and it fills both kettles for us. Did I tell you trolls are simple? The troll said, no. Do not destroy my spring. It is my only source of clean and pure water. I will carry the kettles and you can start the fire, which was exactly what Ashlad was hoping. Because Ashlad could only imagine. It takes 1 kettle to make porridge. What might be cooked in the other? Ashlad stirred up a fire, as the troll returned with both kettles full. He put both kettles on the fire, and as soon as one began to bubble and boil, they poured in the oats to make the porridge. But while the troll was gone, Ashlad had taken a leather satchel that he had carried the curd in, and he slipped it down inside his shirt, because the troll said, "Let's have an eating contest." And Ashlad said, "Yes, I'm sure I can eat more porridge than you can." And so they began to ladle porridge. But Ashlad put most of it into the leather satchel. So it appeared that his belly was growing quite large. And just as his belly was about to burst, Ashlad said, "I am sure I can defeat you." And he pulled out a dagger, a long sharp blade, and he sliced open his belly. And the porridge came out of the leather satchel. "I bet you can't do that." And he tossed the knife to the troll, who wanted to win the contest at all cost. And he sliced open his belly. His entrails poured out, along with his blood. And he fell to the ground dead. And Ashlad, he searched in the camp of the troll, and he found great stacks of gold and silver, more than he could carry, but he carried what he could. And he returned home a very wealthy man. He paid off his father's debt. He added sheep and cattle and chickens to the pasture. He bought more forest, which they selectively cut. And the family, they all lived happily ever after. So both of those stories you might see as a simple fairy tale you might tell to your children. And I hope you take these stories home. Tell them to your children and your grandchildren. But you, being wiser than most children, or at least wiser than some, you see the forestry and turf management built into these stories. Things that I studied at the university. The people who had lived on that land for 1,000 years already knew the benefits of moving your goats so you do not overgraze, of harvesting the timber respectful of the forest itself. These are the kinds of things we can learn from these ancient stories. But the word Ashlad, how many of you have heard of Ashlad? I'm sure you have, but maybe in French or German. In German, it's Aschenputtel. In French, it's Cinderella. How many of you have heard of Cinderella? You know what a cinder is. You know what ashes are. We all have a time of ashes. We all have a time, what we now call adolescence, when we are not sure of ourselves and our place in the world. And sometimes we must go into the dark forest. We must face trial and tribulation and overcome the trolls who are everywhere. In that time of ashes, whether it's Cinderella. But the thing about Cinderella is she is still waiting for her damsel in distress. No, she's the damsel. She's waiting for her knight in shining armor to rescue her. But in Scandinavia, we admire strong women. Do you know one? I married one. Do you know my most favorite story? And maybe one of the most famous. It has been made into film and republished in dozens of books. In the end, it was the title of our collection, East of the Sun, West of the Moon. In the far northern country, there was a family with many children and a father and mother who had trouble putting food on the table. They lived quite poorly until one day they heard a strange knock upon the door. Who could it be at this late hour? When the father opened the door, he saw there a great white bear. He said, I have watched your family and I know you are hungry. If you will give your oldest daughter's hand in marriage, then I will make you as wealthy as you are poor. The father said, I cannot give my daughter's hand in marriage without her permission. Come back in a week and we shall give you an answer. And I will shorten this story greatly in just a moment. And so he asked, and his daughter said, I do not know the man. How can I marry a great white bear? But the family pleaded, we shall be as rich as we are poor. And for her family, she decided she could make this sacrifice. And maybe it would be a great adventure. They traveled off to a castle, and they lived quite well, except he was a white bear during the day. And only when she was asleep did he crawl into her bed when all was dark and he was a man. And she could feel his warmth. And they would lay in the darkness and they would talk. And she heard his kindness. And she fell in love. But during the day, she was alone in the castle for the most part. And so she said, I wish to go and visit my family. And the white bear said, you can, but you must never be alone with your mother. She will try to lead you astray and have a conversation, and it will not be good for either of us. He took her to visit her family, but now instead of a small hovel, they lived in a grand manor house. The children were dressed gaily, and they feasted, and she loved her family dearly. Her mother said several times, what does he look like? I've never seen him in daylight. What kind of a man is he? You must come into the kitchen and help me with dishes. She helped with dishes, and her mother had her alone. You've never seen him. Take this small candle and light it at night so you can tell me what he looks like. She did as her mother instructed, and when she returned, while he was asleep, she lit the candle, and 3 drops of wax fell onto his shirt, and he awoke with the warmth. You broke your promise. If I could have remained here with you for a year, the spell would have been broken, and we could marry. But now I must go east of the sun and west of the moon, for a troll princess has claimed my soul, and that is why I'm a bear in the day and a man at night. And we shall be married at the end of this year. You will never see me again, for I must travel east of the sun and west of the moon. And off he went. But she did not give up so readily. She met an old woman who might know, playing with a golden apple. I do not know, but my sister might. Take the golden apple, it might help you. She met the sister who was playing with a golden spindle. I do not know, but my oldest sister might. Take the golden spindle, it might help you. She found the oldest sister who was playing with a golden spinning wheel. Talk to my friend, the east wind. He will carry you. And take this golden spindle. The east wind blew her to the south wind, who blew her to the west wind, who blew her to the north wind, and the north wind carried her east of the sun, west of the moon, and there was a grand palace inhabited by trolls. She sat outside playing with the golden apple. The princess of the trolls said, what do you want for that golden apple? It is not for sale. Everyone has their price. Name it. I understand a man is enchanted here. I wish to spend one night with him. I can arrange this. Give me the golden apple first. She tossed the golden apple up to the window, and the front door opened. She was led to a bedchamber where her man, the prince, was asleep. She passed the night, but she could not wake him. She shook him. She cried. She moaned. She screamed. She wailed, but nothing would stir him. And the next morning she was led away from the castle. She sat outside and she played with a golden spindle. And the princess of the trolls said, wow, a golden spindle. I bet it has magic. Give it to me. It is not for sale at any price. A second night she could not awaken him. But the third night, the servants of the princess of the trolls were good Christian people who had been captured and enchanted. But when they heard her wailing through the night, they told the prince that a young maiden has been here 2 nights. And it dawned on the prince that every night before he went to sleep, the princess of the trolls gave him brandy, and it made him drowsy. So that night he pretended to drink the brandy, and he pretended to be asleep. And when she came, he was awake. He said, "You have come just in time, for tomorrow we shall be wed. But I have an idea that might save us. Before we are married, I will ask her to wash the shirt that you stained with those 3 drops of wax. And when she cannot, I will ask you. And if you can, the spell might be broken." Well, the next morning, as they prepared for the wedding, he said to the troll wife he was supposed to marry, "I wish to wear this beautiful white shirt, but you can see the 3 drops of wax. If you can wash it, then the wedding will continue." She tried to wash it, but the wax just smeared, and black tar seemed to sink in. The wax attracted dirt. She gave it to other trolls, and soon the shirt was as black as ashes. He held it up and said, "You cannot do this simple thing. I bet that peasant woman sitting by the outside of the castle, I bet even she could wash it. And if she can, I will marry her." And he tosses the shirt, and she boils water. And the warm water melts the wax. And when she dunks it in the hot soapy water, it comes out white as snow. The princess of the trolls is so angry, her head explodes. She explodes. A dozen trolls explode, and the enchantment is broken. And all the good Christian people who were enslaved were now free. And the north wind carried them one by one back to their homes. And the prince had found his princess. She rescued him. And the two, they wed. And they both lived. Thank you for listening. There are 178 stories I could tell you if we had more time. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
That is such a fun show. Again, I have to thank the Swedish American Council for helping to sponsor that research and putting together that performance. He is a character so after my heart. Again, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat. If you're watching on YouTube Live, there's a chat there on the right, and you can add some questions. I'd be happy to take them. Peter Christian Asbjornsen is really a man after my soul because he combines a lot of my interests. I'm trained as a high school biology teacher, worked as a field ecologist. I still participate in citizen science projects like the Great Backyard Bird Count. I've done forest transects, which is, one of his day jobs for many years as the first forestry management for Norway. And I collect folklore, and I love fairy tales. And I've traveled the world collecting and telling fairy tales. And so I also portray Wilhelm Grimm. And so many aspects of Peter's life overlap with mine. It was very easy to step into my shoes. And I should thank Vasa and Kathy Cuff, who's the archive director here at Bishop Hill, because she helped to point me in this direction and helped to write that grant to create this character. But think about it. If you could travel around the world and explore the ecosystem and the culture, and if you best want to understand the culture's relationship to the ecosystem, your key is their folklore. Long before I met Peter Christian Asbjornsen, I was thinking about a PhD in cultural biogeography. Just unpack that. Cultural biogeography. It's all the things we were just talking about. How does culture reflect the ecosystem? How does the ecosystem influence the culture? What is the best way to know that? Through the fairy tales and folklore. In the program, you may have noticed I mentioned another character that I portray, Prince Maximilian from Germany. You know, being one of the lesser children of a king, he would never be king himself. Um, but he had the funds and the resources, and most important, the education. He actually studied with Alexander von Humboldt, who had toured the world. And so he thought, hey, I could do that. And so in the early 1800s, he went to South America, and he wrote in his journal while he's camped out on the Amazon River, I wonder if the people of North America are of the same race, or is their culture different because the nature of their land, the word ecology wasn't a common term yet, was their ecosystem different? And is that what influences culture? And so 20 something years later, he came to North America. He lived among the Mandan and Hidatsa. He traveled up into the Rockies. He spent a winter up there, and he collected folklore. And it was around this time that Peter Christian Asbjornsen and the Grimm's brothers were beginning to publish. And it was Peter Christian Asbjornsen, because he was trained as an ecologist, who really put all of those pieces together. It would be hard for me to find a hero. Well, thank you, Coral, for your comments. Azis Wagush, tell at the end of a troll story a couple weeks ago, an Anishinaabe or Ojibwe story with the Wisconsin Historical Society, but the details were different. A giant, for one. You know, this actually sparks a conversation that Frank Blaine from Pro Video, who is running tech behind the scenes here, we were setting up and doing tech rehearsal and getting ready, and Frank and I were talking, you know, so Coral, it's intriguing to me that different cultures in different parts of the world do tell stories about giants and trolls and elves and gnomes and these magical creatures. And, you know, I'm trained as a scientist, so I'm curious about what might be the scientific evidence or the scientific grounding for some of these magical creatures. And knowing that in the northern glaciers in Scandinavia and across northern Russia, we have found complete woolly mammoths, mastodons that were perfectly preserved, so well frozen that we could analyze their stomach contents and know what their last meal was. I've done a lot of work at the Field Museum in Chicago, and they actually dissected one of these baby woolly mammoths, and one of the scientists said, this meat is so well preserved, I wonder what it tastes like. And he fired up the backyard grill, and they feasted on woolly mammoth. And so all of this leads me to think about, well, what if they found Cro-Magnon or a Neanderthal? You know, we do know that in Ireland, in the peat bogs, they found a person so well preserved that the butter in his pouch was still butter and not rancid. And then we know about the man found in the high Alps in Switzerland that was preserved in a glacier. And so I'm just imagining if I lived 1,000 years ago and there was an unusual warming period and some creature was thawed out of a glacier, it might feed these folk tales and these fairy tales. So thank you, Coral, for your comment. Other questions? We know that there are a couple dozen people out there watching who have tuned in through the course of the evening. Otherwise, I could just talk all night. Another thing that I think I should mention, though, is Peter Christian Asbjornsen and Jørgen Moe, M-O-E with the umlaut. Jørgen Moe and Peter Christian Asbjornsen, I mentioned them briefly in the program, but let me go into a little more detail. They were friends at the university, though Moe became a theologian and Asbjornsen became a field ecologist. They remained friends throughout life, and they together collected many of these folk tales. And so most of the time, if you look them up and find the book that they published, you'll find that they share authorship. I do think it was Asbjornsen who did more of the field collecting, and it was Moe who did more of the academic theological thinking about stories. though you can read introductions to various versions of their book written by both of them. And it's really intriguing to see their thoughts about that story. All of this to say that as I was doing my research, as I was putting together this show, nearing a final draft, University of Minnesota published a new translation and a new transcription of all of the stories. I think it's just simply called Norwegian folklore, Norwegian folk tales. Some very simple, but it's written by Peter Christian Asbjornsen and Jørgen Moe, and I would highly recommend that you look for it. Not only is it a really fresh translation into modern English by somebody who was born speaking Norwegian and is fluent English speaker, but the introduction, the various essays written by both of them, the various introductions that Moe and Asbjornsen wrote are very insightful and really added a lot of depth to my understanding. And I actually had to go back and rewrite parts of the show, which I don't mind. You know, the research is my favorite part. I know that at least a couple of you are working on your own characters. And so let me ask you a question. As you are watching these programs over these couple of days, you know, think about how each one of these performers brings their character life a little bit differently. In just a little bit, you're going to meet one of the most famous authors of all time, Astrid Lindgren. Now, she, I think I mentioned this last night, but it bears repeating. If you look at which book has the most copies in print, the Bible is far and away number one. Number two in the world is the Grimm's Brothers, translated into every known language. And I do think it's fascinating that Peter Christian Asbjornsen first worshipped the Grimm's Brothers and then later met Wilhelm and went from fan to friend. And, you know, just think about that. If your hero is writing complimentary things about your work and your research, how that must have felt for him. But Wilhelm Grimm said that the Norwegian folklore collected by Moe and Asbjornsen added much to the knowledge of humankind. It's a really great quote there. Well, number three behind the Bible and the Grimm's Brothers, Astrid Lindgren. And if you needed to take a break, this would be your moment, because we're going to start her program a few minutes early, since one other little aside. So if you notice, some of this was filmed live outdoors. But as I was wrapping up Peter Christian Asbjornsen, it was about to rain. And so that last story, East of the Sun, West of the Moon, is normally a 20 or 25-minute story. But I could see the rain clouds coming, and we knew that we had to hurry. We had to shorten it up. And so if you're a good storyteller, you know how to clip and when to shrink and when to breathe into a story. In that moment, I had to take each scene. I covered all the ground, but I had to cut each scene just a little bit short. So we wrapped up about 10 minutes early, and we didn't have time for Q&A. It literally started to rain 1 minute after I finished my last sentence. So we had to get all the electronics put away. And that's why Astrid Lindgren was filmed indoors. And we'll begin that in about 2 minutes. So again, if you want to run and grab something to drink, get, you know, a soda water, or whatever your favorite thing is, take care of business. We'll get started here. So one more time, let me thank our sponsors. The Bishop Hill Heritage Association has put together a whole season of programs. And we have actually our Spring Jubilee, the first weekend in April. There's Midsummer, the weekend closest to the summer solstice. I believe this year it's June 25th. And we have 5 bands in the park. You can dance around the maypole. And it's also my birthday, so I'll go ahead and invite the folks who are here. If you want to come to my birthday party at the end of midsummer, it'll be in my backyard at the Twin Flower Inn. We have some live bands. And then we have the Chautauqua in August, sponsored by the Heritage Association. We have Jordbruksdagene, which is our Ag Days, in September. And we have Lucia Nights. Part of the reason I moved to Bishop Hill, part of what I love about Bishop Hill, is we honor that cycle of the seasons with midsummer and Harvest Days, Jordbruksdagarna. There's something every other weekend in Bishop Hill, and the Heritage is a major player in helping to organize that. So thank you, Bishop Hill Heritage Association. And do subscribe to their YouTube channel as well as ours. Thank you to everyone who's already subscribed. I think we've jumped about 60 subscribers the past couple of days. We'll be launching new video every week from here into eternity, as long as the universe supports us. Every week we'll be adding different Chautauqua characters, different history in person monologues, including I've got about 50 kids that we've filmed over the years with the Colorado Humanities Young Chautauqua program that I've been working with. And we just launched the how to step into character. So on the History in Person page, every day this week, we're launching another how-to video, stepping into character in 6 simple steps, sponsored and produced by Colorado Humanities, with Frank Blaine at Pro Video and myself as your host. Our other sponsors, let's run down the list. We have the American Scandinavian Foundation, who helped to fund Peter Christian Asbjornsen. We have Barbara Osher Pro Suiza Foundation, which has sponsored a number of events here in Bishop Hill. We have the Illinois Arts Council, a state agency that helps to sponsor various programs. Bill and Susan Sherrard Foundation, SWIA Chicago, and the Twin Flower Inn Bed and Breakfast are all major sponsors of our events. Let me check one last time here. Any last questions before we transfer? Yes. And, I'm doing a lot of work training kids on how to do this. And even if you put together a 5 or 10 minute piece, it can be very impactful, very powerful way to bring history to life. And I also sponsor the cemetery tour with my daughter, who has taken over, really. I'm her assistant now. The Springdale Cemetery Tour. These are adults who are doing 8 to 12 minute monologues. And it's really a great way to bring local history to life. With the Springdale Cemetery Tour, our focus is on looking at people who are players, not just on the local stage, but whose life impacted, regional, state, national, and internationally. I've played quite a number of characters who are Peoria boys, who were really players on the world stage. Friends of Lincoln, Civil War generals, the ambassador to Russia, at one point was a Peoria lawyer, friend of Lincoln. So it's amazing, the connections. And of course, the immigrants from all over the world who have come here. I've portrayed a German immigrant who published a German language newspaper through World War I, which didn't play out well for him, but was a major player on the state political stage, as well as someone who welcomed immigrants. So, I could talk all day, and I've been talking for a while. I think it's about time to shift gears. Are you ready? I think I'm ready. Let me introduce our next character. As I've already mentioned, Astrid Lindgren is one of the most successful authors in world history. But a few things you may not know about her. She came to North America at the peak. She did a tour of North America, lecturing in Canada and the United States. We tried to figure out how close she came to Bishop Hill. She was invited to the Quad Cities. I believe she also spoke in Chicago. She was at Augustana College, I think. I'm not sure of that. But she in the 1940s and early 50s, she wrote articles about child abuse and raising children in a more kind-hearted and compassionate way. Really a woman ahead of her time. Also, after her tour of North America, she published a couple of not so well received critiques of our treatment of African Americans. And this was before the civil rights movement really got rolling. She called us out, and appropriately so. And some of those essays are available online, and I'll encourage you to go and look for those. But of course, we can't talk about Astrid Lindgren without talking about Pippi Longstocking. When I first moved to Bishop Hill, one of my favorite things we did every year is we had a Pippi Longstocking Day, and we invited busloads of local school kids, and they came out, and I would tell Pippi Longstocking stories. I especially love the Tomty and the Foxbee, my favorite. And then we would play games, and we took some of the games from the Pippi Longstocking books. And the kids would go around and station to station with storytelling and games and snacks. It seems like a lot of her stories have some really wonderful snacks in them. So with all of that said, fasten your seatbelt, let's travel back in time, and let's meet a relatively contemporary author, Astrid Lindgren.
My name is Astrid Lindgren. Oh, but I was not born as her, obviously. It was in 1907 on a little farm that was connected to the rectory in a little village in Sweden. My mother gave birth to her second child, Astrid, they called me. I had an older brother and soon to follow 2 younger sisters. And there I grew up on the farm. My father, doting, loved children, was a daydreamer, but a good farmer. My mother, stern, and she always believed you should work hard. So a doting father and a stern mother didn't always mix, but my mother always won. Yes, she did. Every morning, you children will go out and do your chores, pulling beets, feeding the cattle, and then we would clean up and go to school. And you'd better study hard. I hate to tell you, I did study hard, but I fidgeted terribly. Once they took a picture and all the children in the classroom were sitting very still and I was waving my hand in the picture. They said I didn't get in a lot of trouble, I just couldn't sit. But when we got home from school and we got our work done, for my mother said, you must work and you must love to work in order to be happy, and happy we wanted to be, we would play. My brother and I were expert tree climbers. Even at the age of 40, I could climb trees better than my own children themselves. And it was much to their surprise when I'd come up to a pine tree and simply shinny on up. We loved to wander about the flowers, the streams, the trees, the animals. And this is where I just loved to learn nature. My brother and I, we called ourselves the thing finders. And we would come home with seeds, and we would come home with stones, and we would come home with eggs, and all the treasures that you would have in the great land of Sweden. I also love to write. And I could write in German, English, and Swedish. All 3 languages helped me a great deal through my life. I would write little stories and send them off, and I'll be danged if the editor of the local paper didn't pick up on it. Of course, I had classmates, and that were his children. I would poke them. Did your dad get my story? Did your dad get my story? And he did take notice. I loved humor. I loved to use my imagination. And for my final paper in high school, I wrote a huge paper on the life of nuns in the convents during the Middle Ages. Now, this is a very difficult subject to put humor into. But I was able to work it in quite well. Upon graduation, the editor of the local paper did take note of me and asked me to come on the paper as a trainee. Now, you did not have to go to school in those days to become someone in the paper writing articles. And my task, of course, were obituaries. Seldom did I have my name tag on them, and seldom were they humorous, because that was frowned upon somewhat. There were many other articles. They would search the papers when my name became well known to see what other articles I had written, but the editor never put my name tag on them, so they didn't know. When I was 17, 5 of my best friends, and friends we were for life, let me tell you, 5 of my best friends and I stood on the village square on a fine day in June with comfortable shoes. By the way, if you have to go through life, you really should wear comfortable shoes. We had on comfortable walking skirts and knapsacks, and we set up on a journey. 200 miles we were going to hike through Sweden. And people would take pictures of us, of course. mostly from the behind. And off we sat, stomping along. And the first day out, I did have to get another pair of shoes, and that's really when I learned that comfortable shoes are more important than looks. We would sometimes get picked up. I can remember one day, it was terribly warm, and we'd walked a long distance. Our arms were hanging limply, and our faces drooping sadly, and our feet were at least 1 meter behind the rest of our bodies. And we could hear, oh, behold, an automobile. And so we stood there, so pathetic, and on our loud enough voices to be heard, but pathetic, we said, "Could we have a ride?" And the poor gentleman took sympathy upon 6 sweaty girls, loaded them in, and off to the village we went. If I remember it well, it was that very night in that village. We were to stay at a manor house, but the village itself was having a festival. Maybe it was a Chautauqua, who knows? And there was a great bonfire, and all the young people sat around the bonfire. And they did something in their village that we did not do. They had a singing contest. I never was known to be a great singer, unlike people that have gone before me here. It's difficult to follow a song and dance routine. But they enticed us 6 girls, join in, join in, join in. Well, you hate to be rude. So at last we did join in, and of course we won the contest, for we knew all the most wonderful songs, and we caught the eye of the most handsome gentleman in the whole village, much to the disdain of the ladies. I wrote back to the paper. For every 3 or 4 days, I would send a missile off to the paper so they could publish it, because everyone in the village was wondering, what are the 6 girls doing? I said, it is miserable to be a human, and marriage does not seem to end that at all. We traveled south, past into the hills, past a great lake, over a mysterious mountain that was covered in fog, as if a cat had sat down on its haunches. And from there, we went to large cities. Now, I will confess that occasionally, maybe more than occasionally, we were given a ride. Sometimes we jumped on a little train if we had enough funds, and sometimes the horse-drawn wagons would come up with milk jugs and milk, just like this creamery, and we would hop on and they would take us to the next village because our feet were weary. We came to one village, and I knew Ellen Key lived just a few kilometers outside the village. Ellen Key at that time was a famous author who I just adored, and I really wanted to see her. So we decided just to hike on out there. We were not welcomed, however, and the workers there said, "Did you have an appointment? What are you doing here?" Of course, 6 beautiful girls in their comfortable shoes and their comfortable walking skirt. We've come to see Ellen Key. Well, she's not seeing anyone today, and just then the top window flew open and out popped her head, her hair all disheveled, and said, "What do you girls want?" With all this commotion, her great St. Bernard came out and bit us. And there was blood, and there was screaming, and of course the help there drug us into the house, which was exactly what we had wanted. And after they cleaned her up some, Miss Key came down. The poor thing hadn't even dressed. She was in her petticoats. She looked me square in the eye, and she says, "Button me up," and turned around, and there I was, buttoning the petticoats of Elaine Key. Can you believe it? We were given a fine tour, and then we were taken out to the fine gardens and saw them. Oh, it was wonderful. And then we were immediately sent on our way with a Band-Aid on someone's leg. We wrote home about that experience, I will tell you, and it was published in the paper. Oh, the days of my youth were wonderful. My parents, now remember, worked at the rectory and very conservative people. And one day I came home and I had cut all my long, beautiful hair off into a short bob because, you know, it was about 1917, 1918, and that was the look of those girls then. My father was taken back. My gentle father could not believe his eldest daughter would do such a thing. And my mother did not speak to me for 3 days because she said she did not recognize me. I left the paper and I went to the big city of Stockholm. Now, I call these my very lean bachelor years. And I call them that for 2 very good reasons. Number one, we had few funds to keep me in school there. I went to the Bar Lock Institute. And there I learned stenography, I learned accounting, I learned business correspondence, and I learned touch typing. Touch typing for students was you couldn't look at the keyboard. They would put this piece of paper over the keyboard, and how do you know where the E and the Z are? But you learn, and I became quite proficient at this. But I had left all my friends behind, and I had left my wonderful family and wonderful brother behind, and I had left all that wonderful food from the farm behind. My parents would send a package, as often as they could, perhaps every 3 weeks, perhaps every month. I would cut the cheese, I would take some of the meat, and cut that bread that Mother had made, and I would just dream of being home in her kitchen. But I could only eat a little every day because it had to last. And thus it was my lean years. But upon completion of this, I tried to sell myself at 19 as a very sophisticated woman in the big city. I applied for a job and received it at the Automotive Club. An automotive club in those times, well, automotives were fairly new, and they would race about the countryside, and the automotive club would arrange races, as well as tours about Sweden, and you can stay at this place, and you can see this, and you should eat at this restaurant. And so I helped to organize these. And of course, being 19 and young and gregarious, I was able to go to all these races and get signatures from all these famous drivers. What fun it was! The man who owned the company was named Astrid Lindgren. And I fell in love. And in 1931, we were married. I had 2 children. I had a son named Lars and a daughter named Karen. And during those years, I continued to write. I took care of my children. We would go to the park every day. I would look at the trees, but I dared not climb them in the big city. But I did think about it more than once. I had met many wonderful friends that there, too, I remained friends with them for my lifetime. And I wrote stories, and I would send them to magazines. And my friends and I would sit on the park benches, and we would talk about how the world was changing during the 30s and the evil that was coming into the world in those days. In 1939, Hitler rose to power, and Stalin and Mussolini, and Sweden was to remain neutral. Sweden was to remain neutral. We would hear this over and over, but our fear was still there, as our neighbors would be invaded. I applied for a job at what was called the Institute of Criminology during those war years, and from 1939 until 1945, I worked there as reading all the letters, and I was a censor. I knew more about things that were happening in Europe in those days than most of the Swedes. But I was sworn to secrecy, so I could not share any of it except in my diaries, and even then I had to be very cautious what I put in. But the sad stories would fill me with just dread for these individuals in Poland and Belgium that would write to their relatives in Sweden. It was a dark, dark time. there were a few highlights. One wasn't such a great highlight, but turned out quite well, was that my daughter developed pneumonia. And so she was bedridden, and she would call to her, "Mother, mother, come and tell me a story." And I would sit down with a book, and "No," she would say, "tell me a story." So using my imagination, I began to tell stories about a red-headed girl that lived in Sweden. And she recovered well, and I obviously went back to work. But often she would say at night, "Tell me about that red-headed girl." And we would talk about this young girl. And she would help me make up some of the plots, total nonsense, ridiculous. But it was a light spot in those dark days. And in 1943, she developed the measles. And once again was bedbound and said, "Tell me all the stories about Pippi Longstocking, Mother." And I did. And then I fell on the ice that winter and hurt my ankle very badly. And I was told to lay down and rest for 2-3 weeks maybe. Well, my mother, she had said, "You must learn to love to work." So I thought, I'll just take this time to eat smoked salmon and rest. And that lasted an hour or so. And then I took up my pad and my paper, and because I had learned shorthand quite well, all I needed was a pad and a paper, and I began to write down all these stories that my daughter and I had come to love so dearly. On her 10th birthday, I did get them typed up. My ankle did heal, and I could still climb trees. And I typed them all up and got them put in a leather-bound book. And for her 10th birthday, she was given the original Pippi Longstocking stories. Now, I had a dear friend who was a librarian, Ella Olesen, and she said, "I would like to see this book." So I shared it with her, and she was immediately taken with Pippi Longstocking. It was 1945, the war was come to an end, and the dark times were over, and people wanted something light. She said, "We'll have it published. But you're going to have to take the thing out of there about the bucket of urine, and you're going to have to take all the stories out of there about the manure." And she was crossing out a lot of the interesting parts, I thought. I rewrote it 3 times, and by September, it was ready to be published. I went to the biggest publisher in Sweden, and they sent me a note quickly. "This story is nonsensical. We will not publish it." Ella said, "Oh, what are they thinking?" So she said, "Write a play." Now, she was a librarian, but she was also in children's theater, and she was on the Children's Literacy Board of Sweden. This woman had some clout. She put together this play about Pippi Longstocking, put it on in her theater, put it on in a traveling theater, and all through Sweden, people were beginning to hear about Pippi Longstocking. I went to a second publisher, who I thought was reliable, only to find out later that they were this close to bankruptcy. And they said, "We'll take your story." And the story was published. And Pippi Longstocking became a psychosis in Sweden. That's what they called it, the Pippi Longstocking psychosis. And all the children wanted a Pippi Longstocking book for Christmas. "Yes, let us hear more." And I began to talk on the radio, and I would tell Pippi Longstocking stories on the radio in my best voice without the urine and the manure in them. And it was wonderful. We went to press, and the books sailed off the shelves. Before Christmas, every child wanted a Pippi Longstocking book for Christmas. And the presses went to work, and they were still running the presses on Christmas Eve, loading the boxes and taking those books to the stores so that every child could have a Pippi Longstocking book for their Christmas gift. Between 1945 and 1950, over 300,000 Pippi Longstocking books were sold. Well, now, you know, I told you that I couldn't just lay there, but I did learn I love to write laying down. So I would take my steno pad, and in the mornings I would just write. And so soon I came up with 2 more Pippi Longstocking books called Pippi Longstocking on Board and Pippi Longstocking on the South Seas, because you know, of course, that's where her father was, but maybe you don't, but I will fill you in on all that in a little bit. It was wonderful years. And that publishing company did not go bankrupt. For I was the top salesman. Now, I did get plenty of criticism from children's literature critics who said the story has no value and it's nonsensical and the children learn nothing but bad behavior. It did not make me sad. I enjoyed it immensely. It was to be followed by other books. Some were shorter books and others were longer books. I came up with a character named Emil. And Emil could have been Pippi's brother, perhaps. He was so ornery. And he always got into so much trouble. It was a joy to sit and write. I was able to travel, and soon the books were in many, many languages, all the way to, they said, well, let's go down to South Africa. Let's go to South America. Germany. Germans loved Pippi Longstocking. And the poor people didn't have any paper to even print on in those days, and let alone having a publisher. So we would have to print it in German. I would go to Germany, and because I could speak German quite fluently, I would go on radio shows and read Pippi Longstocking to the children there. It was a joy. It was years of great joy. And then came sorrow. For in 1952, my husband became violently ill and passed away. And it was a year of great grief for me. And I found I couldn't even write. And it was like a shadow had come over me. But my friends, all my friends that I went to school with, all my friends that I had worked with, they all lifted me up and boistered me up. And the editor at the publishing company thought perhaps I could come to work. I said, oh, I will only work half days because I have to lay in bed in the mornings and write. So at noon each day, I would go to the publisher, and there would be stacks of mail. They gave me a personal secretary. There would be phone calls, there would be interviews, there would be trips. It was good years. It was very good years, those 50s and 60s. But in 1976, the Swedish government, which had been a socialist party since the 1930s, did me a bad turn, they did, and I'd always supported them. They were charging me 102% tax. That is a lot. And because I had a name known on radio, a name known in the papers, I just simply would write stories about these finance officers in the government that didn't understand arithmetic. And they would write back in the newspapers about a woman that wrote fairy tales that didn't understand arithmetic either. Well, I pushed the agenda quite hard. It was my first time in a political arena, and I did receive some criticism. But the fall of that year, in September, the Socialist Party lost the election. And it was all because of Pippi Longstocking's mother. So I began to think of other causes. And you know, children's rights were one, for I had seen so many children treated harshly. And so I began to advocate for children's rights. I began to advocate against nuclear energy, for I had a great fear of that. Animal rights, for you should see how they raise some animals. Well, I'm an old woman by now, right? In my 70s, and people said, "How long are you going to continue this?" And I said, "Well, as long as I can hear and I can walk and I can talk, you will hear from me." And by now I had 5 grandchildren. And so I bought a house on a flat rock out in the Fords. And we would have, all summer, I would have my brood there, my brother's grandchildren, and we would march about. People thought we were all crazy. They would come to the house, and I would take a very long spoon, and I would say, "We're going to play the Witch of the Flat Rock." And I would take this long spoon, and I would put chocolate shavings on it and stick it out the crack of the door. And these children would try to get it, and any child that got it, I would reach out and grab them. And I would throw them in the log box, I would, and then I would threaten to cut off their fine locks. But it seemed that the Witch of the Flat Rock could not find the shears. And I would look and look, and while my back was there, you could hear a giggling and a pitter-patter of feet as these children escaped the witch. My daughter said, "Mother, do you always have to instill fear in the game?" I thought it very appropriate myself. I lived a good long life. I received lots and lots of correspondence. They said by the time I passed away, they had put up in the attic, "Lord, thank you for not letting the attic fall down," 750,000 notes, letters, and correspondence. I always would find a cause. I brought 2 girls from Turkey. There was a Kurdish tribe there, and they had read Pippy Longstocking in Arabic. And they'd written me and wanted an education. I said, sure, you come to Sweden, though. I'm not going down there." And one of them became a doctor and came to see me often in her adult life. I had a good life. And it's all because of Pippy Longstocking. And so I'd like to share one Pippy Longstocking story with you, just in case you're not real familiar anymore. In a little town in Sweden, just outside, there's a very unruly yard. And in that unruly yard, there is an old house that is not in the best repair. And that is where 9-year-old Pippy Longstocking lives, all by herself, which is quite good because no one has to tell her when to go to bed. And no one has to give her cod liver oil when she'd rather eat sweets. Now, right next door, there lived a family in a very neat house with a very fine fence around it, a mom and a pop, a regular, and 2 children. One was Tommy, who never bit his fingernails and would always be very, very obedient. And Annika, who never talked back even when her mother told her to do things she didn't want to, and always wore pressed cotton dresses, and she didn't get them dirty. These children often played in the backyard, and they would lean on the gate and wonder, "I wish someone would move into that house so we could play." And one day, that very thing happened. For you see, Pippy Longstocking, she had a mom a long time ago, but she couldn't remember her, for she had died, and Pippy imagined she was in heaven looking through a peephole, so Pippy would wave every once in a while and say, "Don't worry, I'm fine." She also had a father whom she liked very, very much. But he was a captain of a ship, and they sailed all over the world. But on one day, a great storm came up, perhaps named Ida, and blew him off the ship. And Pippy knew that he did not die, for he swam ashore and became the king on a South Sea island. And as soon as he could build a boat, he would sail to Sweden and get her, and she would go back to the South Seas and become a princess. But he had foresight to buy this house with furniture and everything, so that when he got too old to be a sailor, he could live there with Pippy. So that is how she came to be there. She left the ship, and she had 2 items. One was a squirrel, not a squirrel. One was a squirrel monkey that always sat on her shoulder, named Mr. Nielsen. and the other was a traveling bag full of gold coins, which I'm sure her father wanted her to have. So she would left the ship with that, and you would think a bag of gold coins would be very heavy, but Pippi Longstocking happened to be the strongest girl in the entire world. So she simply picked it up and walked off. But on her way to live in this house, she decided she should have a horse. So she bought the horse, and she put him under the other arm and carried the bag and the monkey sitting on her shoulder, and went and lived at the Villa Cula. Now, Tommy and Annika saw this strange girl coming out of the house. And I only say she was strange, for you see, she had carrot red hair, and she had a little nose about the size of a potato right in the middle of her face, which of course is where every nose should be. And it was covered with freckles, her face, and she had a smile that went nearly from ear to ear, and whenever she smiled, her perfect teeth would show. She had a blue dress on that she had obviously tried to make but ran out of fabric, and so she put red patches all over it, and she had one very long black stocking and one very long brown stocking, and shoes that were twice the size of her feet, for her father had bought them for her in South America in hopes that she would grow into them eventually, and she loved them. And besides, if your shoes are way too big, you'll never get corns. This was what came out of the house and began to walk down the street. Only Pippi Longstocking walked 1 foot on the curb, thank you, and 1 foot in the gutter until she disappeared. And then she come walking backwards. And Tommy said, "Why are you walking backwards?" And she says, "Well, everyone in Egypt walks backwards." And Tommy said, "You have never been to Egypt. How do you know that?" "I have never been to Egypt?" said Pippi. "Why, of course I have been to Egypt. Everyone knows everybody walks backwards in Egypt. I have been all over the world with my father, the captain of the ship." Tommy says, "I think you're lying." And poor Pippi hung her head sadly. She says, "Well, do you know, not only everybody walks backwards in Egypt, but in the furthest of India, everyone walks on their hands." He says, "Now I know you're lying." And she hung her head and she said, "Yes, sadly I am lying, for I've been to the Congo and people lie there all the time. From 7 o'clock in the morning until dark, they lie all the time. Please forgive me. But I've spent so much time in the Congo that I sometimes lie. But will you still be my friend?" Tommy said, "Yes, we'll forgive you." But at that moment, he knew this was not going to be a boring day. Pippi Longstocking invited them into their house, and there they saw a horse on the veranda eating oats out of a soup tureen. And they said, "You have a horse?" She says, "Yes, but every afternoon I pick him up and put him in the garden." They said, "Put him in the garden?" "Yes." And she picked him up and put him in the garden. Tommy was impressed. They went in, and Pippi took 3 eggs, threw them in the air, and 2 of them hit the skillet, and the other one landed right on her head. And she said, "Oh, egg yolks are very good for your hair." In Brazil, everyone puts their eggs in their hair, except one man who ate all of his eggs, and he went bald. But he was never allowed out of the house because there was such a hoopla when a bald man would come out of the house that they had to call the police. And with that, she scraped all the eggshells out of the pan, mixed up the flour batter, and threw it into the skillet that was warmed up, flipped that pancake up, then browned it on the second side, flipped it over, and landed on their plate. And she said, "Now eat that while it's still warm." Tommy and Annika ate the pancake. And once they had finished, she took him in the sitting room. But the sitting room only had 1 chair because Mr. Nielsen only sat on her shoulder, and the horse didn't really like the sitting room very much. She had a huge trunk with trinkets of all kinds. Eggs and stones and necklaces and mirrors and eyeglass pieces and Why, it was a mystery to Tommy and Annika. And after she'd shown them everything, she turned to them and she said, "You better go home now. Because if you don't go home now, you won't be able to come back tomorrow and see me again." And so they left. The monkey waving goodbye, and Pippi Longstocking waving goodbye. And Tommy and Annika knew their life would be changed forever. And that is the first story in Pippi Longstocking. And now, the adventures of Pippi Longstocking go all over. She fights robbers, she goes to a circus, she fights fires. She even threw 2 policemen on top of the roof who tried to take her to an orphanage. Pick up a book and read it. They say that Brothers Grimm sold the most children's books. Hans Christian Andersen sold the next most books. And Astrid Lindgren is the 3rd top children's book publisher. And thus, I have been named Pippi Longstocking's mother. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your good attentions. And may you enjoy reading forever.
How did Astrid know about what life was like in a convent? Or did she make it all up?
That is a good question. Of course, she had to do a lot of research, and she didn't have an internet, so she went to the encyclopedia. I made that up. But she did say that the nuns, I should stay in character. I wrote in there that the nuns were wonderful at their handwork. And if they had only had the opportunity to marry, they would have some of the most beautiful underwear in the world.
Well, thank you, Astrid Lindgren. And the scholar performer is Kay Price, truly one of my favorite storytellers of all time, here in the Midwest in particular. She's worked with us often in the cemetery tours, and when I approached her about playing Astrid Lindgren, she hesitated for just a moment, but she dove deep into the research, and now it's a delightful program. I've always loved Astrid Lindgren, and I love her more thanks to Kay Price. And isn't Kay a delightful performer? Kay's actually a retired nurse. She's been a full-time storyteller for, I want to say, 25 years now, doing a lot of storytelling for her church and very involved in the National Biblical Storytellers. And she's here. Hi, Kay. We had a technical issue a little bit earlier, but it looks like you're muted, Kay. If you could hit your microphone, we can hear you. So some questions. Let's see if there's any questions in the chat. My first question, Kay. Somebody asked near the end, and I just would love to hear more. How do you write comedy about life of medieval nuns?
You know, there wasn't a lot of information about that paper, but you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes? Good. But she did talk a lot about their handwork and their fine lace that they put on all their undergarments, the nuns.
Oh.
And then, and so these nuns would show off their underwear to each other in the convents, you know.
Yeah.
I don't know what other good things, what other fun things nuns do, but Astrid could find comedy in everything, as you saw.
As could Kay Price. I love the way you find some of the really subtle humor. Like one of the moments that really caught me off guard is when you talked about a storm coming, like Ida, because we were being hit by a storm. You were supposed to be performing outside that day, but we were getting the remnants of a tropical storm that rained on our parade, but you adapted brilliantly. So let me ask, Kay, as you were doing your research, what were the things that really drew you to Astrid Lindgren? Where did you feel connected?
Oh, Astrid, I loved her life as I had really had hoped to tell lots of Pippi Longstocking stories and fill the whole time. But after I read her bio, her life was so much more interesting than the Pippi Longstocking stories. When she was a child, her childhood just fascinated me, because here she was on this little village in Sweden, and she and her brother and her two sisters, who were friends forever until her death, although one sister passed away. That inspired me, because, you know, even through her hard times in Stockholm, her sisters and her brother always supported her, and her mother and father. And then this adventure that she went on with her 5 friends. Oh, how I wish I had done that when I was 17 years old. You know, I'm going to go on a 200-mile hike and see the country. And I'm sure it was somewhat safer then, and then, you know, you wouldn't do that today. But then her years, also her war years, fascinated me. That she worked for that criminology institute, and because she knew so many languages, she was able to read those letters and translate those letters. And then, of course, you know, you black out all this information. And so that was fascinating. But to know that she had this crazy sense of humor to write Pippi Longstocking, and she had so many stories rejected, just short stories rejected prior to that, but then she made the right connection with the right person, and, you know, the first publishing house turned her down, and the second publishing house acted like they were on good financial grounds, and they were about 3 months from bankruptcy, and they took her story, and look what happened. She turned the whole company around. And it was quite a phenomena at the time. They had Pippi Longstocking parties. There was a park that you could ride to the villa, and you could go to the little town, and probably like you do up there at Bishop Hill, you had a Pippi Longstocking outing, and everybody would dress as Pippi Longstocking. I bet you they had more brown socks and sold, and red hot hair dye, you know, and those braids stick straight out. How do you get a kid get their braids to stick straight out?
I don't look very good in those braids, though. I've tried.
But she was very interesting. And then in her later years, she became quite a political, and she had a lot of causes that she fought for. And she had enough money that she could, and enough fame, that she could make a real difference in the world. So
I admire that. I know sometimes, you know, popular, you know, celebrities, whatever, get grief about it. But, you know, if you've got the platform, do you just talk about the weather, or do you talk about what's important in the world? Do you talk about what's important to you? And having read some of those essays that she wrote later in her life, I was very much inspired. I mentioned before the program about her editorial on America's treatment of people of color. And, you know, this was a woman ahead of her time, and really calling us out, and doing so in a way that was fierce and gentle. And we need more of that, to be self-critical. And she was willing to do that. Shifting gears, though, I love the tomte stories. If anybody's been to Bishop Hill, you know that we have garden tomtes, like garden gnomes, all over the place. I even took 2 tall trees and had them carved into 10-foot tall tomte. What do you know about the tomte or her other children's books?
Well, she loved. She always said that she wasn't a nationalist. She wasn't, you know, she was for the world and not just for Sweden. But then she developed those tomte stories, and tomtes are not 10 foot tall.
I know, they're tiny.
Yeah, just so you know. So, and she said when she wrote those stories, I love to be Swedish. And, you know, they were translated stories mostly, rather than her originals, but they were stories that were of the oral traditions that she had published, put in. She had a beautiful illustrator that worked with her, and so those stories too became popular. She had another set of stories, and I am sorry I can't conjure up the name of them, but about a little boy who kind of gets lost in life, and it kind of has a sad ending. So not all of her stories are nonsensical. Some of them are very serious and give you you know, a pause. And she was very big on children's rights too. She felt that some children had been abandoned, and and she had some difficulty with her son in his early years too. He was in foster care for a while, and she really struggled to become the mother that she became, but she was a wonderful mother to both her children.
Yeah, and I will say that if people out there are curious, you can Google and look for some of these other essays on child welfare and African American rights and women's rights, because she was an insightful writer, whatever subject she chose. So one last question that I often get asked, and I appreciate, so I hope you appreciate the question. How do you feel like you are a better person because you know Astrid Lindgren? How has the research and development of this program inspired you?
I have a terrible confession. As a child, I did not read Pippi Longstocking stories. So when I prepared for this, I got all the books, and I just sat down and I read story after story, and a story, and I would laugh out loud. My husband would say, and then he took the books and he read them. And I felt like Pippi Longstocking was a little bit like myself, because I had some orneriness in my day.
No, not Kate Price.
Yeah. And she said things, she just said them. Pippi just says things, and so does Kay Price, kind of. But Pippi Longstocking always had a good heart, especially for her two friends. And even in the last book, they have Christmas together. They come back from the South Sea. She's always taking care of those two friends. They're very important to her. And, I think it showed that, friendship, even then and even now, is something that you need to work on, and you need to cultivate, and you need to cherish. So, that would be one thing. The other thing is she had some obstacles. Her marriage was a little rocky. Her years in Stockholm were very rocky, and there was a lot of controversy in her village about her reputation at times, but yet she just rose above it. And so I think that is what I learned perhaps from Astrid, is to rise above the bickering and the bad things that happen to you, and make the world a better place.
Yay. That's a great answer. I'm inspired by you, inspired by her. We did have a wonderful comment from the storyteller Coral Conant Giles, who said, "Please tell Kay that I had to continually remind myself that you weren't actually Astrid Lindgren." Well, why remind yourself? Just buy into the disbelief. For this 40 minutes, she was Astrid Lindgren for me too. And then she asked the question, can you talk about Astrid Lindgren's relationship to and activism around the Swedish style of socialism, which is real different from the way Americans think about socialism? Do you know much about her involvement in those kinds of things?
I do know that she was a strong supporter of the Socialist Party, and that in the 60s, the Socialist Party turned to a more greedy system rather than a more communal system. And that's when her tax rate went up to 105%, which later they admitted that was an error. They should not have charged her 105% tax. That would just kill you. And she wrote that people didn't go to work because they didn't want to get paid, because they didn't want to have to pay taxes. So people would work for food, or they would barter in those days rather than try to pay the tax. So she really turned against the Socialist Party in the 60s, and she really rose a public opinion about it, and she was able to bring a defeat to the Socialist Party in the 60s. So, and there was a lot of criticism back in those times.
Yeah, well, again, using her platform for the common good. So again, thank you, Kay. That was a wonderful and delightful program. Please reach out if you'd like to host a performance of Astrid Lindgren. I'm sure Kay would love to come visit you folks. And allow me to end by thanking our behind the scenes, Frank Blaine, Pro Video. Everyone give Frank a round of applause, even though he can't hear you. And show some love. Frank has done a great job all the way through, fixing our little glitches. and making it pretty seamless. I mean, there are things he did you guys didn't even notice. And then I have to thank our sponsors: Bishopville Heritage Association, American Scandinavian Foundation, Barbara Osher Pro Suiza Foundation, Illinois Arts Council, a state agency, Bill and Susan Sherrard Foundation, SWIA Chicago, and the Twin Flower Inn Bed and Breakfast in Bishop Hill. Please hit that red subscribe button if you have not already. And each of these videos will be available, 6 different performances, on our YouTube channel for 1 week. So if there's somebody you really want to share it with, you can, but don't post it on a lot of public social media because this is just for those who subscribed and pre-registered. But you have my permission to just put the link in an email, but not on social media, just for a week, and then it'll go away. But over the next several weeks or months or years, I'm thinking every Tuesday we're going to drop a new History in Person video. So if you've subscribed to our channel already, you'll get to see those. You'll get to meet Charles Darwin and Walt Whitman and Maya Angelou and Julia Grant, First Lady. We have a lot of things already filmed that we'll be uploading over the next several weeks. Children's performances as well as adults. So if you want to send me a link to a 8 or 12-minute story, you performing first person, you could be part of the History in Person program. We've also published a series of books. We have about a dozen books in the series already. If you look them up on Amazon or go to my webpage. And we've got a dozen more books in the pipeline. Our goal is 25 books by the end of this year. So reach out to me if you would like to be part of that project. And please come visit us in Bishop Hill. And whether or not you're Swedish, we were celebrating our Swedish heritage this week. America's story is an immigrant story, and Swedish Americans have played a major role in everything from bird watching with Roger Tory Peterson to work internationally and government and politics all the way around. Swedes have played an important role, as have many immigrant nations. So our story is your story, and thank you, Kay Price, for sharing your story. So
thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.